And we are live. Thank you for joining the Union Sex Work panel this evening. I'm Shivangi, the Union's Women's and Non-Binary Officer, and I'm delighted to be hosting the panel event today. Discussions around the sex work industry are almost never given a platform in mainstream media. And the rare times it is, the tropes of victimization and moral policing color these narratives. This panel will aim to challenge this by having an open discussion on the industry on a global scale, approach the challenges faced in activism and academia, as well as touch upon broader themes of inclusive feminism in society and how we can be better allies to those in the industry without actively harming their interests. Today, we are joined by a very exciting lineup. We have Dr. Sharmila Parmanand. She has a PhD in multidisciplinary gender studies from the University of Cambridge on the prestigious Gates Scholarship and is currently a teaching fellow at London School of Economics. Her research examines the prevalence of sex trafficking discourses and interrogates how development and state intervention targeted towards women in the global south can actually affect and shape their lived realities. We also have Miranda Kane. Miranda is an award-winning comedian, writer, and performer who gathers her experiences and also more recent work in organizing body positivity events. In 2012, she wrote and performed her first show, Coin-Operated Girl, for Edinburgh Fringe, and went on to receive 5-star reviews and sold-out venues throughout the UK and Australia. She wrote and starred the Audible sitcom Slaving Away, which reached #1 in Audible charts and was one of their most downloaded podcasts of 2019. And lastly, we have Dr. Camille Babagallo. Camille's research focuses on women's work that is both waged and unwaged and addresses questions of gender, social reproduction, and labor relations. She's also very actively involved with the organization Decrim Now, where she focuses on the unionization of sex workers, strippers, dancers, and hostesses. Sharmila, Miranda, and Camille, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you speak at the Union, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion today.
Thank you.
So I suppose we could start off with a brief introduction to each of your focus of research and your specialization. Miranda, could you kick us off?
Yeah, yeah, no problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Miranda Kane, and thank you for your lovely introduction, Shivangi. That was lovely. And yeah, I was a sex worker in London for over 10 years, and I've since been doing comedy about it in the hope of trying to make people laugh and hopefully think about the laws surrounding sex work. So I find that comedy is a great way to connect with people, so I use it to try and talk to people who have never thought about sex work or prostitution or anything like that. They're just normal, average, everyday people. So one of the reasons why I wanted to do a show at Edinburgh was just to, you know, get an audience in and talk to them. Like, it's lovely to have people watching this, but you're probably already people that are interested in the sex industry and the laws around it. And I'm after your dads. I'm after your parents. So if you're like, Mum, Dad, you've got to figure out why sex workers need rights, tell them to come to my show, where I will bombard them with 50 minutes of knob gags and then 10 minutes on solid decriminalisation chats. They'll love it. It'll be great. So my evidence and my area of research is more just lived experience and anecdotal evidence from my work in the sex industry and from my friends that are still in the sex industry and continue to be until this day. Sorry for saying knob gags. I'm sorry. I had to get it out there.
No, absolutely. Camille, would you like to continue?
Certainly. Thank you for having me. My name is Camille Babagallo, and I'm a feminist organizer, first and foremost, with the Women's Strike Assembly. And I've been active in the sex worker rights movement here in the UK and also in Australia for the last 20 years. Time is marching on. In terms of what I do in my academic work, As the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic has made so powerfully kind of demonstrated, not only are we living through multiple and intersecting crises at an ecological, environmental, and social level, but where it's now more clear than ever, I think, that it's reproductive work that makes all other work possible. So what do I mean by reproductive work? At a rather simplified level, my research investigates who it is that performs all the cleaning, cooking, care, and sex work in our societies, where this work is taking place, and under what pay and conditions the work occurs, as well as I continue to explore kind of ongoing concerns that people have about the value and the meaning of this reproductive work, which I think remain contested in feminist scholarship and also are really live discussions and debates in homes and workplaces across the country. Thank you.
No, that's lovely. Lastly, Sharmila.
Okay, so hi, I'm Sharmila. I'm also very happy to be here. I am from the Philippines, and I previously worked in anti-trafficking. And within the anti-trafficking space, as you'll probably hear from me in a bit, there are some problematic assumptions that are being made about sex work and some oversimplifications that are being made about sex work, right? That, you know, every sex worker is a passive, ignorant victim in need of rescue, essentially. And at one point, we perhaps may have bought into that. And then in the course of my work, came into contact with a lot of sex workers who really challenged this. And that is the inspiration behind my PhD journey then. So I was like, hey, maybe we're doing something wrong here. We are actually making things worse for the people we are claiming to help. And so in all of this, in all of this legislation and policy making, sex workers were invisible. So I was like, I want to write a dissertation that actually centers what sex workers have to say about this stuff, especially in a context where it's criminalized and it's very hard for them to publicly advocate. So a lot of my work is about the Philippines, that's slowly expanding into Southeast Asia as anti-trafficking gains currency outside the Philippines as well. And the other thing I do is I do research work with the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women. So we look at migrant workers and policies around migration. And, we're like, please do not institute restrictions in the name of protection. Migrants' rights should be very rights-based policy. So that's another thing I do.
Oh, that sounds absolutely interesting. I suppose we could start on to focus more on the topic by perhaps defining what sex work is. And the reason I want to ask this is because often, as the three of you mentioned, sex work is conflated with either trafficking or various other negative connotations are associated with it that take away the legitimacy of the industry. So how would you go about defining sex work, the industry, and who sex workers are in a manner to foster honest discussions in an open manner? Anyone?
Shall I? So I would say that anyone who is in the sex industry, that is there for pleasure, but also, like, number one, sex work is consensual. Like, if it's not consensual, then it's not sex work. That's why we always say, well, I personally always like to refer to it as sex work, because then that's where the consensual connotation is. If it's not, then it's something completely different, and that's where we need to talk about rights and helping people. But as the broad spectrum of, like, who are the people are that are sex workers, it's anyone from sugar babies. If you're taking your clothes off on camera, you're a sex worker. If you're on OnlyFans, you're a sex worker. If you're snogging someone for a bit of you're a sex worker. And come and join us under our umbrella. Come and be a sex worker and start fighting for rights. It's fine. There is no judgment here. We are a lovely bunch of people. But yeah, first and foremost for me, it's someone who provides pleasure consensually.
Yeah, and I think building on that definition, we could remind ourselves that there's a real diversity of workers, as Miranda was talking about, and that often the debate is really focused on prostitution. And even within that, it's focused usually on two stereotypes. One, which is a vulnerable and usually drug-using street worker, and the other is this mythical middle-class happy hooker who supposedly loves her job and is from the upper middle class and hangs out in posh hotels. And so I think it's really important, even within full service sex work, which we could think about as prostitution, to understand the kind of breadth of the people who are working in it. Men, women, and trans people are all working in full service and in the sex industry more generally. And they have a variety of immigration statuses, from people who have immigration papers and it's easy for them to navigate kind of national borders and laws, through to people who are more irregular and have irregular immigration status, as well as we often forget, you know, if we think about the sex industry as the buying and the selling of sex and sexual services, we often forget about all of the support staff that are needed in the sex industry. So from security guards to receptionists to managers, and also that we've seen a real diversification since the lockdown in how people are continuing to make money from the sex industry, and a lot of it has moved online, and some of it has continued in person as well. But we would also add to that dancers and strippers and performers, and all of the plethora of online workers and content producers, as well as all the people that work in pornography. So once you start to understand the full kind of ecology of the sex industry, it's actually a very large workforce. It's a very diverse workforce. Often we say at the union, there's a sex workers union now in the UK, that we're not really here to pass judgment on the work that people do. What we're here to do is to recognise that many men, women and trans people have a diversity of experience. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, and some of it's really ugly. But that the best way to approach those kind of questions and that diversity is through centering the need for rights and the need for labour rights specifically.
Sharmila, if you would like to feed up on that.
I'm happy with the definitions provided. One thing I'm just going to highlight here is there is a gradation in terms of how explicit or direct sexual services are being sold. And as Camille said, there seems to be a fixation on situations where they're sold very directly, like for street workers, for example. But sex work is it's a much bigger spectrum than that. And at some point, I kind of want to leave people with a provocation, which is sexual services or sexuality isn't always sold directly. Even in some experiences and interactions and encounters we have that, people are unhappy about labeling sex work, sex is being transacted and bartered, and that's something we should be keeping in mind. These conceptual boundaries are quite hazy.
I really appreciate that, Sharmila, in terms of, I think one of the provocations is that on one side we have kind of prostitution, which is this heavily stereotyped and gendered and racialized kind of concept. And on the other is marriage, right? Which is a whole institution where people are doing usually sexual acts for kind of remuneration or security or increasing their status or gaining access to land or for visas and a whole variety of different things. And I think once we put into the mix some of the other sacred institutions, like the nuclear hetero kind of family, then all of a sudden our kind of fascination and our fixation on prostitution starts to become a little bit more kind of troubled. So I think it's a really good place to start in terms of thinking about sexualized work and how that ends up getting stuck to certain bodies and who it doesn't get stuck to as well.
So yes, I think we can all agree that it is these stereotypes that actually negatively hindered those in the industry. And I suppose from both an academic and a social activist perspective, how do we go forward with deconstructing these stereotypes, both in our daily conversations or in our subconscious, as well as depictions in the media? Like, how do we ensure that these stereotypes are effectively broken down? Because they seem quite entrenched in mainstream society at times.
Miranda, did you want to take the floor?
Yeah,
on
sorry,
this
I
one?
didn't want to keep going first. Sorry, I'm just trying to be polite. Move out the way. No, it's so well. That's why I wanted to go into performance, because I was so tired of seeing the same stereotypes and the same stigmatism falling onto sex workers and you know, all of the people that I saw on telly, none of them looked like me or the people that I knew. None of them were trans. None of them were black. They were all skinny. They were all drug addicts and trafficking victims. Or when we did see, again, like the mythical, like happy hooker stereotype, none of them were just average people who were, you know, just doing it to pay the rent, which was what I was doing. You know, it's just like, so for me, my way of trying to break down the stereotypes was just start talking about it, and just to join in the conversations, the things that were happening on Twitter, the things that were happening on social media, and just to find out a bit more about it and start educating myself from the very, you know, basic ground up. And also, and what I do now is I'm a bit of a bugbear in people's sides, in that I will point out when things are being made and they haven't had a sex worker on the staff, they haven't had a sex worker be a writer. I'm very much a proponent of nothing about us without us. So I try to work with people to try and write my own things, so that something is out there that has been done by a sex worker. But it can be so difficult, and because it's all the entertainment industry and the media industry, and that's all run by men, and it can be very difficult. So it's pointing out when things are being made. So there was one on Netflix recently called Bonding, but that was made by a man, and it was made without a sex worker on the writing staff at all. So it's just about for me, I will point out when things are being made without a sex worker, and support things that are made by sex workers. Go see the shows, go and look online for online strip club. That's a fun thing you can do. Just watch an online strip club from the comfort of your own home. The East London Strippers Collective, for example, they're the ones making things within themselves, so it's not done by someone else who's going to get all the money. So yeah, I would say just try and support the things that are made by sex workers and point out the things that don't have ones within the writing staff. Is that a really basic thing? It's a difficult question, because you don't know who is a sex worker, because a lot of them don't want to come out. You know, a lot of them don't want to say, yeah, hello, I'm a sex worker and I was an executive producer on this. So it can also be very difficult to do that. I totally get it, but it means, you know, supporting more the ones that you know have got someone who has had experience of being a sex worker. It's
I think there are like two levels here that I would make suggestions on, right? So there's the broader public discourse structural level, and there's also the individual level. My biggest issue with how anti-trafficking laws were constructed in the Philippines, but globally it seems, is there are deliberate discursive maneuvers, like deliberate attempts to like exclude sex workers from the conversation. What do these look like? These look like things like pathologizing sex workers, right? Saying your trauma is so deep, the violence you've experienced has left you damaged, or whatever rubbish, right? And therefore you are not an authority. You can't speak authoritatively about your work because you don't know what's in your interest. So that's one way of excluding sex workers from the conversation. The other one is to replace them with quote unquote more legitimate subjects. For example, trafficking survivors, right? Who advocate for the ending of the sex trade completely. No, I think trafficking survivors are, deserve a voice and they need to be included in the conversation. But their experience cannot be taken as representative of everyone who has engaged in sex work. Those are very different things. Like in the same way, you're not going to talk to a migrant for migrants' rights or domestic worker rights or factory worker rights by just looking at the subset of that population that was trafficked and assuming that they speak for everyone else in that category, right? So that's another way of excluding sex workers, by according discursive privilege to certain groups at their expense, and then just speaking on their behalf. Also recognizing that in many contexts, so the UK is a bit different, right? But in many contexts, sex workers struggle to organize and to collectivize. So in the Philippines, they are criminalized, right? So you can't even like publicly form an organization, legally register an organization, get office space, open a bank account, appear on TV, appear in consultation. So keeping in mind that they are being actively suppressed from having any political agency, and insisting that sex workers need to be driving the conversation about laws that affect them. Otherwise, it's not a valid law, right? So that's one. That's a more structural conversation, I think, just insisting that they always have to be there. Funding sex work organizations, for example. The second, on an individual level, there is a certain brand of feminism that makes me really uncomfortable. So whorephobic feminism, for example, this whole like, we appropriate a lot of like sexy stuff, but we draw the line at sex work for some reason. And there's a lot of social distancing that women do. I'm not like that girl. I'm not a hoe. I mean, Missy Elliott, I'm not a prostitute. So even a lot of our, and that's why it's such a lonely place, because a lot of our feminist icons who do all right when it comes to abortion, who do all right when it comes to reproductive rights, even LGBT rights, they fail us when it comes to sex work because they're whorephobic. So holding our feminist icons into account, holding our feminist role models into account, right? Not engaging in those kinds of otherizing and violent whorephobic practices. Like, I'm not sure what a woman gains by saying I'm not a hoe. Like, what do you gain from that? We all lose if the game is about who is more pure, right? So not buying into that kind of feminism, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
And I think in breaking down those stereotypes, one of them is to maintain a really clear lens on what criminalization does. And it's through understanding how whore stigma and criminalization work together that we're actually able to understand how we actually move forward in terms of making the lives of sex workers, not just in the UK, but globally, a hell of a lot better in terms of, like, I think all those things that Miranda talked about in terms of the politics of representation are 100% correct. And I totally agree that having sex workers involved in research projects, in entertainment projects, in policy projects are all really important. But I think that even in the UK at the moment, like for instance, at the moment, MPs in the Labour Party are currently pushing an amendment through Parliament called the Nordic Model Amendment, which would see the criminalisation of clients. And this is being done within the same kind of whorephobic kind of feminist rhetoric that was just referred to. And what's very interesting is that for 10 years here in the UK, we've had huge amounts of sex worker organising, right? We have a plethora of sex worker organisations and collectives and projects. Sex workers run community centres. We've been unionising sex workers in base unions up and down the country. And yet still, none of those collective voices are allowed to be a part of the debate in terms of the Nordic model, right? Sex workers are systematically denied if they say the wrong thing, if they go off-piste and then don't perform being the proper victim, right? And it's very hard to perform being the proper victim if you have an articulate argument against criminalisation, which usually discounts you from being allowed to speak any further. So I think in terms of breaking down those stereotypes is really understanding that what holds a lot of those stereotypes together is criminalisation, and we need to be against it in all of its forms.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And speaking of the governmental approaches towards the industry, there is quite a lot of significant interest from our union attendees who would like to know what are the various legal models that are around sex work. And I think this was touched upon briefly. More specifically to the UK, what is the legal situation here? And is it taking a turn for the better or the worse?
I think I can just very quickly answer that, which is that it's always important to remember that in the UK still, it's legal to buy and sell sex. The other really important thing to remember is that they've criminalized every single other thing around that right that people have to buy and sell sex at the moment in terms of the law. So we live in a quasi-criminalized environment in the UK, which actually makes it incredibly difficult for sex workers. It makes it difficult to be supported in your role because support staff are all criminalized. Management is criminalized. They're known within the whorephobic kind of language as pimps. It's the things you were mentioning before in terms of it's very difficult to open a bank account. It's very difficult to buy a house with the proceedings of that you earn from sex work. And we constantly in the United Kingdom are fighting, I would say, and it's very depressing in some ways, this form of feminism within the parliament that's being led by Labour Party women, Diane Johnson, Stella Creasy, which seeks to increase the level of criminalisation in the sex industry. That's what the Nordic model does. And we know from France, we know from Ireland, we know from every single country where criminalisation has been increased, the people who suffer are sex workers, number one. And they suffer to the extent that their physical safety is harmed. And in some instances, like in France, we saw the death of sex workers massively skyrocket after the same laws were implemented in France that the Labour Party women are proposing as part of the police and crime bill, which is why Decrim Now and sex worker rights organisations have joined together to fight the new policing and crime bill, which is currently being rushed through Parliament at the moment in terms of rejecting that Nordic model. I can leave someone else to maybe outline the differences. The one thing I think is very important to outline is there is a difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. So if someone wants to pick that up, I think that would be good.
At the moment, just to quickly add, at the moment, it's legal to sell sex as long as you're working by yourself. So one of the main things why we want decriminalisation, and I just want to touch on the fact that decriminalisation is a word that's been appropriated by the supporters of the Nordic model. So when we're talking about decriminalisation, we're talking about two sex workers or more being able to work in a flat, in a house together, which seems the sensible thing because that's all we want to do out of safety. At the moment, that's totally illegal. I can only work by myself, which obviously makes things a lot more dangerous. Or if someone is with me, but they're working as what we call a maid, which is where they're taking the phone calls or they're just cleaning up or, just making sure that nothing is dangerous is happening, they're profiteering from the money made from prostitution, so they're illegal. So when it comes to the Nordic model means that the clients would be criminalized. So allegedly the sex workers don't get banged up, put in prison, fined, whatever. They do. That's not how it's been working out in the countries that have the Nordic model. They're still stereotyped and stigmatized. It still makes it very hard for them to do all the things like get a bank account, get a house, get anything like that. And at the moment, we've also got, oh my God, it's so tiring. You've got so much, there's so many things. So like even having a website or having money in a PayPal account, if you've got a bank account, if you've got any money anywhere, banks can just go, and this is in England, banks can just go, no, that's been made from prostitution, so we're having it, and so they can take all your money at any moment. So with decriminalisation, we just want to be able to work like we would in any normal job, working with someone in a flat, whereas the Nordic model would mean that it's totally criminalised for guys to come and see us, for customers to come and see us, but practical wise, it's not worked out that the sex workers have been made any safer. The only thing that has worked out to be safer for sex workers has been full decriminalisation, as we've seen in New Zealand, which is just where people can work together in their flats. Sorry, if that helped at all.
No, that's a wonderful answer. If anyone would like to add to that, otherwise we could move on.
I suppose the only thing to add is that often a lot of the people who are whorephobic feminists point to countries where sex work has been legalized as kind of examples. They often point to Amsterdam, to the windows of Amsterdam, or to Germany, to the mega brothels. They're very worried about mega brothels. I think what's really important to understand about forms of legalization is that it operates as a form of criminalization, because the way that legalization works is it designates where and who and how sex work can take place, and that if anything happens outside of those legal areas, it's illegal. So it's a misnomer to think of these spaces as legal sex work spaces, where in fact actually it helps to bolster and the repression of sex workers, and particularly migrant sex workers in legalized environments, suffer from not being able to access them if they don't have the right papers, and coming in contact with a lot of state authorities through forms of legalization. And that we see that sex workers' human rights and their labor rights are actually often not enhanced. And so through the sex worker rights movement, there was a lot of thinking about how we wanted to approach decriminalization and what's best for the vast majority of workers in the industry, not just the mythical happy middle-class hooker. And what we really there's an international movement of sex worker rights activists who, talk with people in Thailand and the Philippines and New Zealand and in India and in Argentina. All of the places that I've just raised have really strong collectives and organizations and spaces where sex workers are debating and discussing what's best for them on their own terms. And one thing that we've really identified that needs to go hand in hand with decriminalization is unionization, because decriminalization simply stops the law coming and being on the bodies of sex workers. But what unionization offers is a non-state remedy that enables sex workers to take on the power imbalances with their employers, right? Because there are employers, there's bosses, there's managers, there's pimps, and just like pretty much every other boss and manager, they're looking to make money, right? Which is where we end up in instances around increased and forced exploitation. So to be able to tackle that, what we don't need is another series of laws, which are usually implemented imperfectly and end up usually not getting the bad guys and usually end up just hurting sex workers. What we need is unionization, and we need collective power at work, right? And where people can get together like in every other industry and work out for themselves what their contracts should be and what needs to happen at work. And through that, I think it relates to our first question around stigmatization as well, right? By insisting that sex work is work, we're insisting that sex workers are workers. And what do workers need? They need unions, and they've needed unions for about 250 years. And it's unionization that has cleaned up a huge amount of industries throughout capitalist history.
Kind of very quickly add to that, if that's okay, Shibangi.
Ed.
I think it's really important to make this point because a lot of people who argue against decriminalization are using straw man arguments, right? They always point to bad legalization models as the monster to explain that what we are advocating for is pimp state. That's not what sex workers are advocating for at all. So it has to be clear what model is being defended and then what model is being misrepresented, right? Yeah. So I don't think anyone here is defending the Nevada model, for example. I don't think anyone here is defending, confining sex workers to specific brothels, which then give brothels like monopoly. I don't think anyone here is defending hard zoning, for example, or mandatory registration, which hurts migrants and which just creates its own different tiers, right? That's not what sex workers are defending. But if you listen to people like Julie Biddle, that's what they misrepresent to be what sex workers are defending. So conceptual clarity is very, very important here. So the specific features outlined by Camille and Miranda, people need to pay attention to that. And that's what they need to be responding to, right? A model where sex workers have political agency, can unionize, are not confined to specific locations or employers, can work together, can work in cooperatives, are not required to register where migrants can also engage in sex work, that's the model that sex workers are defending. And people, there's a lot of muddying of the waters that's happening, and intellectually dishonest arguments that are being put forward. So we need to be very clear about what the lines are.
Yeah. We've also, I just wanted to also add on the subject of migrant workers is that with full decriminalisation, we want migrant workers to be able to work and to be able to access safety, to be able to access the police, to be able to have help when they need it, rather than when it comes to the kind of decriminalisation that the Nordic model, when they're appropriating that word, and with the legalisation that you see in Amsterdam and Germany, means that migrant workers don't have access to be able to, to be able to report abuse. Whereas with full decriminalisation would mean that they would also be protected from abuse and have access to help from the law rather than be persecuted by it.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. And I feel that this is something that when we talk about decriminalization or legalization, these two terms are often lumped together and not many people really understand the intricacies and the nuances of it. And I suppose this ties in with the fact that how we can best support sex workers and be allies without actively harming them. Because I am aware quite a lot of feminists claim to be inclusive feminists, but often leave out the voices of sex workers, especially sex workers who belong to gender minority communities or are migrant undocumented sex workers. So how do we go about being allies without actively harming anyone or speaking over them?
Start if you want.
Yeah.
I think this question of feminist engagement with the state is always a very, very difficult question, because the state is a lot of times not a pro-feminist institution. A lot of state institutions are very masculine. The way the courts are set up, the way the police force works, for example, right? The state is a lot better at restricting women's freedom and restricting women's sexuality than it ever has been at creating freedom for women and gender minorities. Like historically, it has a very bad track record. So it's kind of poison, but it's part of the solution, sadly. Like, we can't disengage from it, right? So we need to be very strategic as feminists about how we engage with the state and make sure that our impulses for care, and protection do not get co-opted into forms of control or do not turn into forms of control instead. So solutions for me, like solutions that advocate a lot of policing, are generally a bad idea. If front and center to your, campaign to quote unquote protect sex workers and migrants is a very active role for cops or anti-immigration agents, you're not going to be helping those people. So even the Nordic model, right, the way it's kind of played out in the Philippines is sex workers are like, you claim that you're only going to arrest our clients, but obviously we need those clients, right? Like, their source of income. So we're going to keep transacting with them, which means the police are therefore surveilling us too and harassing us as well, right? And demanding bribes from us as well for these transactions to continue. So you're not helping anyone by putting the police front and center here. So reducing the power of the police and of anti-immigration officials over the lives of sex workers is very, very important, I think. And I think we want to prioritize interventions, if we must ask for interventions, that increase political agency of sex workers, so that allow them to form unions, that allow them to publicly advocate for themselves, legally register as an organization. So that's the path that we should be following, as opposed to speaking on their behalf and then kind of like rescuing and rehabilitating sex workers.
I think you smashed it out of the park there with that answer, and definitely ticked a lot of the boxes. I've got written down abolition on my notes in terms of answering this question. But I think it's a really important one to labor a little bit further in terms of not only if our solutions involve kind of more police and more immigration officers, and if those are the agents who are doing your rescuing for you, then it's definitely not rescue and it's definitely not helping anyone. But more in general, the way that criminalization ends up affecting workers in terms of wanting to leave the industry and do something else is really difficult if you end up with a criminal record. in terms of your interactions with the state, in terms of the welfare state, of you might potentially have your children taken away from you, you might end up losing your house, you might end up having other employment jeopardized by being outed or doxed on the internet. And so all of those ways are ways that I think that the continued criminalization and stigmatization of sex work ends up harming people who are currently working in the industry, and also those who have previously worked in the industry, and how we could think about empowered ways that people might move in and out of the sex industry without having to be forcibly rehabilitated, which is what the Crown Prosecution Service presides over at the moment in the United Kingdom. I also think it's really worth really raising that if we want to help marginalized workers, then we need to raise the minimum wage. And that raising the minimum wage means that people who work in the sex industry might have other options to do other employment that might actually be able to they might actually be able to survive on. But at the moment, if you work your guts out and work full time on minimum wage, you take home around £18,000 in the UK. If you've got a child and any kind of expenses, or you live within a sniffing distance of London, everyone would know that that's not enough money to live on, right? And so we need to address why people work in the sex industry. They work in the sex industry to earn a living. Otherwise, they're doing something else, right? And so one of the main reasons that people work in the sex industry is because they're not able to find well-paid and flexible work that works around their disabilities, that works around their childcare commitments, and works around their studying commitments. And so in working on social programs that lift everybody up, we actually help provide more opportunities so that people can continue to make as many decisions that they need to in terms of moving into the sex industry or moving out of it. And in terms of not harming sex workers, I just would go back to Miranda's point of actually having current sex workers working alongside you. So if it's a research project, do you want to continue in the fine anthropological tradition of kind of seeing sex workers as this object of fetish and continuing to produce research that reproduces those kind of tropes? It's harder to do if you have to have that conversation with a real person, you know, like, and I would really ask people to think about their own investments in these kind of in this kind of process, and that it's really not about you and how you feel about sex work as an ally. If it makes you feel icky or uncomfortable, or if you yourself could never consider doing it, I just recommend that you shut up at the end of the day. And because this actually isn't about you, it's actually about increasing the labour and the human rights of a section of the workforce who have historically suffered a huge injustice, and that injustice is a racist and really sexist and misogynistic injustice.
I just wanted to add as well. Sorry, I think I climbed aboard my waffle copter earlier on because I wanted to just say that what I was talking about when it comes to people in the media is that I just think it starts at home. I think being a good ally starts at seeing what's being placed on the television, or what's on YouTube, what is being put in front of your eyes that is about sex workers. And very often it is this fictionalized version of them. So to be a good ally, I think you should go out and support people like Decrim Now and English Collective Prostitutes. Take a look at National Ugly Mugs, who are currently teaching police on how they can approach sex work and how they can make it safer for sex workers rather than keep persecuting and prosecuting them. So it's and they just need things like your money. Give them a bit of cash, sign all the petitions that come your way. There's currently a big ECP petition about the policing bill because they're trying to sweep the Nordic model into it by using that. And so sign the petition, share it amongst your friends, tell people that you support the decriminalization of sex workers. You get on social media and talk about it. If you're fans of feminist things, all these feminist icons, if there's a writer, if there's a podcaster, if there's a presenter who bangs on about how I'm such a good feminist, tell them to talk to a sex worker. Me and Nikki Adams, we recently did the Guilty Feminist, well, recently, like 3 years ago, before pre-pandemic days, but we did the Guilty Feminist podcast, and that was episode 235. It took them 200 episodes to finally talk about sex work. That's not good enough from a feminist podcast. We need to get more feminists talking about it. Just to put their flag in the sand of where they stand on it. If they don't agree with decriminalisation, fine, but talk about why, so that other people can shout at you on Twitter, like me. No, but if you believe in decriminalisation, then get them to talk about that. Get them to have a sex worker or someone who's been in the sex industry or someone who knows about it on to talk about it. I think it all starts with what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and what you're listening to. If you know, things like laws and things that are happening in Parliament, sometimes you can feel like, what control do I have over that? But you have Twitter, you have access to Facebook, you have access to social media, you have access to all these petitions that are online. Sign them, share them, make sure they get out there, and make sure that you are a good ally by just putting your signature down, taking 5 minutes. That'd be great, and donating some money to either ECP, English Collective Prostitutes, NUM, Decrim now. Do they? I don't know whether do they. Yep. There you go. Give us some money. Go for it. But that, very simply, is just for me being a good ally.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I'm sure this will be very helpful to all our event attendees who are hearing this now. And hopefully this would mark their journey of becoming a more proactive ally. There's a very specific question from a few audience members who would like to know, to what extent has the pandemic negatively impacted sex workers, and if there has been any positive thing to come out of it, for example, increasing access or perhaps online engagement, or if anything. So
I think it's pretty safe to say that the pandemic has had a devastating effect on the lives of sex workers. Every single sexual entertainment venue, so that's all strip clubs, have been closed since the middle of March last year. And a lot of sex workers were unable to work because of health and safety concerns during the pandemic, during the lockdowns. And one thing that I would like to flag is that what we did see was the Swarm, which is a sex worker rights organisation made up of sex workers and led by current sex workers, initiated a mutual aid fund for sex workers, and it raised over £250,000, and £250,000 was distributed in cash payments to sex workers, in £250 cash payments at the beginning of the pandemic. But what I think that it demonstrated is how far we've come in being in the debate in the UK in terms of people understanding the need to stand in solidarity with sex workers, but also that we could have raised millions and millions and millions and it wouldn't have been enough because people lost their entire livelihoods overnight. And that unlike the vast majority of other workers, were not able to access any furlough payments. And because of the criminalised and stigmatised nature of their jobs, many sex workers were not able to even access the small amount of support that was given to self-employed people, which was in no way sufficient for, like, just to give you an indication, self-employed people make up a quarter of the UK workforce, and the UK government totally abandoned them in reality. But for sex workers in general, it has been an incredibly difficult year. And on a kind of union point of view, it was in February of 2020, like 3 weeks before lockdown happened, that we won in the Employment Tribunal, we won workers' status for strippers and dancers across the UK, which is really similar to the Uber drivers case that we've just seen go through the courts. So one of the shortest lived labour victories of all time, because only able to be operationalized for about 2 weeks before every single workplace that it applies to closed. So Obviously, we're going to see a slow reopening of the economy, and I think sex workers, just like every other sane person who's been driven by science, would like our government to reopen in the safest possible way and not just rush. We had anecdotal evidence from clubs in Berlin that reopened during the pandemic, that transmission rates were actually quite high. And so we do really need to take health and safety seriously. One thing that I would say is that the sex worker rights community globally has a long history of understanding its own needs in relation to health and safety. We've lived through an AIDS pandemic previously, and also are a highly kind of regularized workforce in terms of being forced to have medical procedures and medical testing, usually as a part of legalization processes. So I think it's been an incredibly difficult year, but it's also shown certain kind of indications of the kinds of agency and autonomy and self-organization that workers' movements bring, which is around providing mutual aid for each other and also being clear around what actually our health and safety needs are.
Mm-hmm. I think I just want to add, like, because I think there is a sort of fallacy out there that, oh, we've got all this fantastic technology, so surely sex workers are just going online. Bullshit. No, it's just as hard. It's even harder for sex workers because they're now fighting against, you know, people who just think, oh, I'll just get online and show my tits and then I'll make loads of money. That's not how it happens. But also you have people like Bella Thorne who are getting on to OnlyFans and taking away their custom when they've already got the money. They don't need an OnlyFans account. People are desperate, and some of them don't have access to the internet or the knowledge. Like, that's presuming a level of privilege that a lot of people don't have when you're talking about, oh, just go online and start working on OnlyFans or anything like that. So please don't start believing the fallacy that sex workers are now using technology. Whilst I am very proud to be part of the sex worker community because we are very good at using technology. We've been at the forefront, like voicemails. You wouldn't have PayPal without us. You're welcome. But at the same time, because you also have these people in Silicon Valley who are making up the rules, like you can't show a nipple, and which means that your whole business could be taken down overnight if they see a picture on there they don't like. So it's not as easy to just say, oh yeah, they're fine, they're all online now, because they're not. They're still in trouble. They still need money. They still need help. And if you want to help, then yeah, I'm so sorry, I forgot about Swan. But join up to mailing lists and all these different types of charities, and they are charities. They don't get government grants. So sign up to them and just donate to them so that if this happens again, you are there giving £10, £20 to a mutual aid fund that will help people.
I'm just going to very quickly add to that. So I agree, not everyone can move online. The capital that's required to even succeed in this space is different, but also some governments then have taken it upon themselves to use this as a reason for further digital surveillance. Yeah. So there are serious security issues and privacy issues with being online. Again, going back to what Camille said, right? Like this whole attempts to help sex workers by protecting them, by kicking them off the internet, supposedly for their own good, just obscures the very structural reasons for why people are doing this, which is, it's all about economic redistribution. So when someone tells me I want to save someone and help someone, but they're not walking the talk by talking about economic redistribution and raising the minimum wage, that's suspicious, right? What are you doing? Pulling them out of sex work so you can make them work in a factory where they're massively underpaid? Are you actually helping them? I'm very suspicious of the intentions of anyone who's walking that line.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And in consideration of the time, I suppose as a closing question for all of you, to what extent do you feel positive and optimistic about the public attitudes towards the industry on a global scale? And if you've seen any shift, whether that's negative or whether hopefully moving forward and more progressive? So
I feel quite positive But I feel quite positive just because I think we've just had a massive pandemic and we're going to see a rise of sex workers. So we're going to see more people who want sex work decriminalised just because they're having to do it to survive, because they've lost their jobs, or because they've lost being on furlough. They can't work. So, but also being able to talk to each other is amazing. Like, social media has absolutely changed the way that we communicate and how we can do things like try to unionize and get together and talk about these things and be more educational about them. So for me, I feel quite positive just because I think we're living in such a sort of new age now where people are trying to find more about sex work, and they can see the rights and legislations and what we're trying to fight for online, but it can be quite demoralizing because every 5 minutes someone's trying to push through the Nordic model, and they're not trying to push it through in an honest way. They're trying to slip it in with different other bills. It's never like, right, this is what we're trying to do. And I think realizing the way governments try to sneak it in is something that a lot of people need to understand, because if they do, then it means that thousands of people have become jobless and homeless overnight, like we saw when Sesta and Foster was introduced in America, which is which I'm not going to go on about now, but that basically like criminalizes being able to advertise online, which again is something else that keeps sex workers really, really safe. So yeah, personally, I feel optimistic, but more optimistic because we're doing things like this and we're talking about it, and we can do that. And we can talk to each other more. But yeah, it's still, we're knackered, guys. We're really tired. So yeah, it can be demoralizing when it's just the same things trying to be pushed through again and again and again, when the evidence is there that full decriminalisation works.
Yeah, I suppose I have a mixed bag of emotions at the moment. There's definitely been a generational sea change. Everyone under the age of 40 that I speak to pretty much sings from the same hymn sheet, which is that we need to give sex workers more human and labour rights, and that the best way to do that is to remove the criminalisation and stigma from their lives. And that means that we can't be trying to criminalise or rehabilitate sex workers as if we were operating in Victorian England, which is where many women in the Labour Party seem to be stuck. It's demoralising that a certain cohort of feminists control a lot of the media and control in terms of have positions within The Guardian and a whole variety of kind of progressive spaces, and that they just flatly refuse to engage in good faith in this debate with the sex worker rights movement. And I would recommend that everyone gets along to their local Kill the Bill demonstration, which is happening tomorrow on May Day. It's a great day happening across 36 demonstrations happening across the United Kingdom tomorrow, of which sex workers will be at all of them, because someone you know is a sex worker, you just don't know that they work in the sex industry, is always a good thing to remember. And so I'm both positive, but I think in terms of Miranda, it's incredibly exhausting to see the kinds of the kind of continued attempts to criminalize the industry. And at the same time, I think that we're seeing a rise in authoritarianism and right-wing politics in general, both in the UK and across the world. And that we know historically that the people who get thrown under the bus first are the queers and the sex workers and the drug addicts and all of the people who are deemed to be undesirable. And so those kind of global and local shifts in politics should ring real alarm bells for the sex worker rights community. So we have a lot of solidarity work to do across our movements. But at the same time, I've never seen the sex worker rights movement as organised as it is right now. So go and check out decrim.org.uk and sign the open letter against the Nordic model. Very quickly, I'm going to say I'm cautiously optimistic. It's, you know, it's
I haven't, like, I do feel like there's a generational shift, as Camille said. Even just 5 years ago, right? The number of journalists, researchers, universities asking me to talk about this in the Philippines, I would not have imagined that 5 years ago. I think we've made a huge stride there. But, you know, I don't think progress is linear. Like, that's a myth, right? Like, we're going to win some things and then there are going to be backslides. So as the profile of the issue raises in the Philippines, for example, obviously you have a reaction because people who are invested in criminalizing sex work, which they, you know, mask as end demand, are going to react and are going to fight back. And you expect that backlash, right? So we just have to, it's exhausting, but we just have to accept we're playing the long game here. Our position now is better than it was, but I don't think it's going to be smooth sailing. It's really not going to be smooth sailing. There's going to be, and then that's why, you know, Cambridge Union and things like this, it's really valuable to have spaces like this to build consciousness.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And in terms of the time, I think it might be a bit wise to wrap it up now. So just to reiterate, I would like to thank all of our panelists for taking part in what has been a very illuminating and very educative discussion. Thank you for taking part in this discussion and really educating us on various issues we wouldn't have thought of either ways. I would also like to thank everyone who's tuned in to watch our event live. And also please do keep an eye out for the further union events this week. Have a wonderful weekend ahead.